Hi, my name is Sarah Quinn. I'm the Vice President at Connect Media and Connect Commercial Real Estate. Thanks for joining us today. I have Dan Ahrens, the Chairman of the Colliers Tenant Advisory Council, joining us today to talk a little bit about office space and how law firm users are using their space. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to join you, Sarah.
Dan, how are law firms using flexible space to address short-term and long-term occupancy requirements in today's market?
That's a good question. I don't think law firms are really using flex space that much to address their attorneys' concerns for working close to home and providing more flexibility for them. I mean, you're seeing a lot of that in the kind of the hub and spoke model where firms will reduce the size of their headquarters and start to do some satellite offices in the suburbs, maybe 2 to 3. But you really haven't seen law firms start to do that much. Really, where you've seen law firms do that is in litigation matters, where they get a large case and want to be able to set up a war room or something like that for a period of time. And then they just go out and rent the flex space for the duration of that case or that matter.
Have law firms' occupancy requirements changed over the course of the last few years? And is that more or less so than other professionals that are taking up office space?
I'd probably say that the law firm's use has changed less than the general office user. I qualify that because, part of that question was also about financial institutions too, and I'll touch on that later. But in terms of general office, users are absolutely looking at, to some degree, at hybrid working. And the office is now looked at more as a place to do professional development, to mentor, to train their employees, and just create collaboration and try to instill the values of the corporation any way they possibly can in the culture of each of those corporations. So many users are creating more space for meetings and more dedicated areas that employees can use to collaborate. It used to be like, most spaces were kind of 50-50, like in terms of heads down space and 50% collaboration space. We've seen a heavier percentage move over to collaboration now. So a larger percentage of that is now collaboration space. Law firms, we're already starting to, they've got conference rooms and they've got dedicated offices already. So you're not seeing quite as much work being done in the law firm spaces because they really didn't need to do much to get them that dedicated space. And they already had the community space that they needed. That being said, over the last 2 years, law firms have had a really, really good opportunity to kind of experiment with their working remotely. And you've seen them take full advantage of that. Many of them have been very successful with, doing some sort of hybrid work. And, I think the key there really is you've seen that law firms have let their lawyers get untethered from their offices, i.e. they can work remotely, they can work throughout the office, they can do whatever they want to because of the technology that's been enhanced and, where they can, where they can do their work throughout the office.
Does that mean that law firms are configuring their space more similarly to other occupiers than say they were 5-10 years ago when they may have been more traditional?
I'd say probably not. I mean, they're not, in terms of flexibility, they're becoming more flexible in terms of the hybrid model, which is ultimately what firms, and ultimately the firm will need to take less space, et cetera, because of it. But the configuration will ultimately be very similar to perhaps, more conferencing and the flexibility to use offices and double them up as hybrid areas and make them more huddle rooms, et cetera. But that's really, once again, getting back to that kind of technology. It's really more enhancing the technology and just adding monitors and enhancing the teleconferencing capabilities in each of those huddle rooms, et cetera. So, I mean, we've seen some firms try to be more efficient by having, more associates in smaller offices, maybe going to an 80 to 90 square foot office, kind of a cockpit office. And firms are definitely using lounges more effectively now than they used to. They're more of a focal point in their space. They used to be kind of in the back of the office. So you've seen some of those trends. But at the end of the day, lawyers still want their own space and they still want a dedicated heads down space that they can use. So the changes have not been that dramatic.
You mentioned some law firms taking less space. Do you think that as we see this next round of renewals that we're going to see law firms downsizing on their leases?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. Generally, firms are downsizing more when they relocate. We're seeing kind of a reduction of about 30% when they relocate. versus 15% when they probably renew, because it's just a little bit difficult to get everything that they want and then in that perfectly in that renewal space. Whereas if they, relocate, they're starting with a clean slate. What I will probably see is, you're going to see a lot more of the same size offices, less storage space, shredding the libraries, but this was all going on a long time ago. So, I think that firms were starting to downsize before we ever saw the pandemic, but now it's just kind of accelerated that cause. And, we've seen firms, like I said, we've seen some of the firms hybrid, and we've seen a little bit more aggressive position in terms of how they're using their office space now.
And then what about concessions? Are you seeing concessions higher in some of those gateway markets where people tended to flee those big cities like San Francisco and New York? How is that comparing to other markets across the country?
I'd say a little bit different story with New York and San Francisco. Definitely the coast, you're seeing greater concession packages, but a large part of that's because they're charging higher rents. So naturally, as landlords give concessions as part of that rent, the higher the rents, the higher the concession packages. So you're kind of seeing New York and LA both kind of follow that. I mean, or San Francisco, I should say, more than LA, but you've kind of seen both of those guys, charging the highest rent. So therefore the concessions have been greater. But in San Francisco, you've also seen the vacancy rate change dramatically. And in Class A space, it was 4.5%. Now it's 17.1%, which is a pretty dramatic shift. And you've seen those landlords, therefore, get a lot more aggressive. So where landlords were offering $10 in tenant improvements before, now they're up to about $125. That's a pretty dramatic swing. And they were also offering no abatement, and now they're offering, probably 12 months on a 10-year term. So you've seen San Francisco be a lot more aggressive. I mean, overall throughout the country, you've seen kind of that same thing. You've seen concessions go up dramatically, in large part because of the tenant improvements and all the issues with construction in terms of sourcing everything. So case in point, like in Chicago, we've probably seen rents go up or rents go down $1 or $2. So you've seen that concession, but where you've really seen the concession is in the improvements and the concessions. I mean, what used to be $80 to $100 in Chicago is probably now $130. So you've seen an increase of $40 to $50 in concessions, and yet rents have gone down $1 or $2. So you're probably seeing the landlords get about a $5 to $6 net effective lower return. So the tenants haven't seen the benefit because the construction's gone up so much, but the landlords have been suffering in terms of having to give a much greater allowance than they used to.
How long do you think that goes on for?
Quite frankly, I mean, I think it continues. In most of the markets, what we're seeing is, there's probably a 20 to 30% reduction in most tenant spaces. Keep in mind that comes over a 2 to 5, 7, 10-year horizon because leases expire at different times. So, I think you're going to see that continually trickle, like a 1 to 2% vacancy hit in most markets for the next several years. So I think the markets are going to continue to be soft for 2 or 3 years. And I think obviously with this economy, that's not helping matters either. So, I mean, I would expect, if anything, the rents will soften even further than they would have in light of what was going on with, the changes due to the pandemic.
Perfect. Well, Dan, I really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You got it, Sarah. Appreciate it. Thanks for all your time.
Thanks.
Take care.